Hi. You were mentioning about the booklet Engaging Critical Theories, the one that written by Dr. Sherwin and Dr. Sawyer.
Yes. Yes. So Dr. Shenvi has a great website, shenviapologetics.com, where if you're looking at all things contemporary critical theory, he doesn't like using the term neo-Marxism, cultural Marxism. I do. But he's got tons of book reviews there on original authors. Great website. He's a theoretical physicist or theoretical chemist from UC Berkeley, did postdoc work at Duke University. But he has spent the last 5 to 7 years really spending all of his time on this issue. And then he co-wrote the booklet, and they're co-writing a full volume book now with Dr. Sawyer, who is a white supremacist scholar at UNC. I forget which UNC school there in North Carolina. One of them.
All right. Any other questions? Oh, go ahead.
I'm Dr. Miller.
Hi, Daniel.
I'm Daniel. What can you say about the separation of church and state? Because some of our pastors here in the Philippines wants to sit in the government office, maybe as an advocate of a change.
Yeah, so at least in the American social political philosophy, it used to be the left that accused the right of imposing morality. Now it's the left and the right looking at the new left, the Marxist left, of strongly statistly imposing morality. So the new authoritarians are the new left, and even the old left is a bit scared. From a Christian viewpoint on church and state, again, there's very little written about in the New Testament. You have Romans 13, for example. Jesus says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. You could say there's an argument of silence, or you could argue from a libertarian position that best government is limited government if you have the chance to control government, because power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, that was the read from the reformers, from Calvin and so forth, and that's why the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists, who were originally very influential in the founding of America long before the 1776 War for Independence. In 1636, Harvard University began, founded by the Puritans, to train pastors and ministers, and it was about truth for Christ and the church, right? But the Presbyterians, or presbyteros, or elder rule, when you look at church government, they had the conviction that it wasn't an episcopal government like a pope or high church model where you have a CEO or president on top called a pastor, and it wasn't a kind of democratic kind of a church government governed by the people. Instead, the view of the reformers was the middle view, that you elect certain wise and godly, Titus, Timothy, and so forth, elders, or presbyteros, Presbyterian. And that was the early influence, let's say, in America and in America's political philosophy, that because power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, we need to have various branches of government to check each other, because there's this thing called sinful nature. That's not Marxism, that's Christianity, and people are oppressors by nature in this fallen world. And so we need to, do everything we can and have a Romans 13 just government that's brandishing a tough sword for a reason. And so anyway, the view of the reformers, especially coming out of Europe, was that they didn't like this idea of a state church. And so they had this separation of church-state in America. And it wasn't the atheists that came up with the idea of the separation. It was the Christians. Most of them were Christians. the secularists have exploited the term and reinterpreted it and revisioned it to put the church in the closet while everybody else comes out of the closet. And now you're not even, you don't even have the freedom to go in your closet if you think the wrong thoughts, because then the thought police come around, and that's, what the commissars or what the political officers in the Red Army would say. There's truth and there is political truth, right? Is it politically correct? You can't even go into your closet now if you have a politically incorrect thought, because you've just violated a blasphemy law, and that must be punished. But the original imputation of it was, or the impetus was because of the founding of America, coming out from a Reformed perspective that the church and the state are two different jurisdictions. We don't intend by this to mean that the church ought to be separate from God or the state ought to be separate from God. We want a godly state, a just state, a good state, a responsible state, a virtuous state, led by virtuous leaders. And likewise with the church. But the church had the juridical authority to baptize or to serve communion or to circumcise or whatever, or to excommunicate. They did not have the power to execute or to raise an army or to raise taxes. That was the role of the state. The state likewise had the power to execute, to raise an army, to raise taxes, but not to excommunicate or serve communion or baptism, right? And the church's role was the minister of compassion. The state's role is the minister of justice. We're now trying to confuse these and have social justice, and that's a problem. Grace means getting what you don't deserve. Mercy means not getting what you do deserve. And justice means getting what you deserve. When we confuse these together, we're back to the state church. And that was never the intent of the founders in America, never the reformers, and not what we find in the New Testament. So we want a godly state, or at least one that is along the lines of natural law, justice. Let's go with Aristotle, giving each his due. It works great with Aquinas, and it's a common view of justice. So yeah, they're separate and they have separate jurisdictions, and we should not confuse the two.
Excellent.
All right.
Thank you, Dr. Bill.
All right, Dr. Miller,
Okay.
take it away.
So back to the drawing board here, share screen. And I'm not going to take a whole lot of time on this one, but this was the title of a peer review publication that I did in International Philosophical Quarterly. So I have 2 books, for example, on philosophy of religion, 2 books on Mormonism. I've done chapters and other booklets and things like that. But I have a peer review publication on Marxist thought, and it's on the Epistemology. And even with that, I'm not going to be able to spend a whole lot of time on it because I'm 41 slides in and I've got 107. That guy's planned for 6 hours here. So the title of it, though, is A Critique of Marxist Epistemology or Theory of Knowledge, Epistemology of Religion from a Religious Epistemology. And, Marx saw religion as illusory, like Freud did. But again, it's brought on by external conditions, external socioeconomic conditions. Freud thought it was internal conditions of the mind. It was wish fulfillment, maybe even hard or soft-wired, but we're psychotic. That's what he thinks about religious believers. Because both believed that naturalism did the death blow to natural theology, and after David Hume and Immanuel Kant, all that's left for a religious believer is a leap of faith, Soren Kierkegaard, or skepticism, right? And so you no longer waste your time coming up with arguments for God's non-existence. You just assume God does not exist. And instead, now you try to explain religious belief, the delusion that it is, either by external or internal ways and means and methods, right? Freud had the internal, Marx had the external. But Marx saw religion as illusory. It's some sort of epistemic defect, some sort of cognitive dysfunction, as it were. The place where he began talking about some of this was addressed in what he called the Jewish question, which considered the desire of many Jews for political emancipation or liberation within the German Christian state. And the question ultimately was about the place of religion in general with the state, because the Jews in Germany wanted to be Jews first, Germans second. And a nationalistic Germany wanted full allegiance, especially if it was National Socialism. And socialism is a state-building worldview until it gets abolished and you end up in communist utopia where even the state is abolished. But socialism is a state-building worldview. It commands the whole of you. So there was this problem. These nasty Jews wanted to be Jews first, Germans second. What are we going to do? And that got him thinking about the whole thing of religion. And he thought that, look, Marxism, socialism entails a classless society, minimally. That seems precluded by serious religion. So he was willing to countenance nominal religion for a time. But from his viewpoint, humanity could not be fully anticipated until serious religion was eradicated. The opposition of religion to human emancipation can only be had when the opposition itself is made impossible, namely by abolishing all religion. It's right there in the Communist Bible or the Communist Creed called the Communist Manifesto. That's part of the bones of Marxism. You can't chew the meat and spit out that bone. It's part of the essence. Marx talked about economic criticism. Again, when we get to critical theory, this is where all this is coming from. Critical. Criticize the heck out of everything Western, all of its values, raise seeds of despair and discontent and anxiety, foment revolution, so that the good guys can come along and save the world and bring us to utopia. But religion is just one of those things. You've got to abolish it just like private property, because you cannot have a classless society when these doggone religionists want to be Christian first. They need to be Romans first. It's the Roman Empire. You need to declare Caesar as Lord. You need to commit the German state first, or the Soviet state first, or again, communism, it's not about the geographical state. They want the spread of communism. They don't want borders. They want open borders. That's the nationalist socialist that wants borders, right? So this problem with religion is central. He had economic criticism, but Marx viewed that as tertiary. He viewed secondary was political criticism, more important, more fundamental than economic. But even more fundamental than political and economic criticism is religious criticism. Marx said that religious criticism is the criticism of all criticisms. You cannot chew the meat and spit out the bones and still be a Marxist Christian. It's an oxymoron. And so there's a second way that Marx says that you can get rid of religion. The first way is you give them all an iPhone, give them all a redistribution of wealth and power and balance in every way possible, and they'll just get rid of religion like a snake shedding its old skin. The second way is if they won't let it go, they're going to have to take one for the team. And it's going to be red, and it's going to be bloody. And he said the French Revolution was the ideal. He says, quote, certainly in periods when the political state and as such comes violently to birth in civil society, and when the men strive to liberate themselves through political emancipation, the state can and must proceed to abolish and destroy religion, but only in the same way as it proceeds to abolish private property by declaring a maximum, by confiscation, or by progressive taxation, or in the same way as it proceeds to abolish life by the guillotine. You can't chew the meat and spit out the bones on religion. Religion has got to go. We'll wait for a while. Most of you you'll just get rid of it yourself once we give everyone an iPhone, same iPhone. Give everyone the same wage. But if you don't let it go, nasty Jews can't keep being Jews first. Nasty Christians have got to be socialists first. The state comes first. This is the reason, by the way, that Soviet Russia, part of the reason, broke up on the West, the Muslim side of it, because Islam exacts the whole of you too. Sharia law and Marxism are both state-building worldviews. And so in Chechnya, there was no way you're going to have peace there. Christianity is the only one that's spawned and operates fine within a democracy. And even when Israel became a nation, it could have become a theocracy. It didn't. Found democracy was very good. At any rate, this is where Marx goes with, the evolutionary process. Religion is the opium of the masses. They'll get rid of it themselves. If not, you're going to have to get rid of it, and they'll have to take one for the team if necessary, because it's about the collective. It's about the team. And the individual dissenter, they go to the gulags. Individual rights, that's part of the Enlightenment or part of this vestigial of Christianity. Now, there is a meta-context in which the epistemological issue takes place. It does not concern itself, again, with the veracity or truthfulness of religion. Marxism isn't concerned with the veracity of religion. It is with the tenacity, but it just simply assumes that religion is false, and people who believe it are suffering from some oppression, and they pass that oppression on to other people because they won't let the state be first. They won't let the collective be first. They won't let the team be first. And so his view emerges within a materialistic, naturalistic worldview, giving naturalistic explanations of religious belief in terms of poor socioeconomic oppression. And the religious person will come to have his senses no longer dulled, and he'll be able to see himself as oppressed. But what religion does is it dulls the oppressed, woke, enlightened consciousness that would naturally develop if religion wasn't there. You would see it. You would rise up. Workers of the world rise up and unite against your oppressors. And so we get this thing called standpoint epistemology. It depends on your social location, on where you're at. Are you part of the oppressed class or the oppressor class? The victim, the victimizer, the bourgeois, the proletariat, the have-nots. See, part of your of being an oppressor, part of your whiteness, if you're a white person now, I'm jumping ahead, is that you can't even see it. You're so blind to it, you just need to sit and listen, because you're not going to be able to see it anyway. You're blinded by it. See, the problem is an epistemic defect, but it's brought on by poor socioeconomic conditions. Well, Alvin Plantinga in a Reformed Epistemology sort of turns that on its head and says, look, unless and until you presuppose the truth of naturalism, of atheism, then there is no good Freudian or Marxian objection to religious belief, because all such objection presupposes an answer to the metaphysical question of God's very existence. You cannot even start with the question about the rationality of religious belief until and unless you presuppose an answer to the metaphysical question about the veracity of religious belief. But Marx and Freud and gang followed the Enlightenment and just assumed, well, why not change that shoe on the other foot? It turns out that it's the Marxist who is oppressed by his self-deceptive Romans 3 sin and spiritual blindness, and he's blinded by his sinful nature. So two can play that game about wish fulfillment, right? So you get people like Thomas Nagel, famous atheist philosopher today, who talks about his cosmic authority problem, that he doesn't want God to exist, even though he thinks some of the smartest people he knows are religious believers. He doesn't want a world by that. He calls it a cosmic authority problem. Isaac Asimov, the most prolific atheistic writer ever, said, emotionally, I'm an atheist. I don't have the reason to prove God doesn't exist, but I so strongly suspect there is no evidence for it that I don't want to waste my time. But emotionally, I'm an atheist. Aldous Huxley, same thing. Emotionally and sexually and economically, atheism frees him. So what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Who is of socioeconomic, or who is of epistemic defect, really is the one who has not answered the proper way on the prior question of the veracity of God's existence. And so Calvin wrote of the sensus divinitatis, and he called it the AC model, Aquinas-Calvin model. He says, God has implanted in us a natural tendency to see his hand in the world around us to the extent that everyone would come to believe in God naturally if it weren't for sin. So again, two can play that game. You can go look at Calvin's warranted Christian belief and so forth. I'd love to share more on that, but I will say a couple of things here. He's got a brilliant argument that I deal with in the paper too about naturalism plus evolution. That if you believe naturalism is true, that's one thing. If you believe evolution is true, that's one thing. If you believe naturalism and evolution together are true, you got a major epistemological problem. Why? Because it comes with its own self-defeater. If I evolved purely naturalistically, that means my brain evolved. If my brain evolved purely naturalistically, we're not talking theistic evolution, then that means my logic evolved. And if my logic evolved, how do I know it evolved correctly, and how do I know I'm really here? Right? Well, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. I can know I'm here, but I don't know you're here. You're never going to convince the perception skeptic, whether you're a theist or an atheist, that your perceptions are reliable without a track record argument that is some kind of circular reasoning that they were reliable yesterday when I tried them, right? But at least theism has a good way of answering the question about what is proper function in a way of forming properly functional beliefs. Because in theism, the supposition is that God created man in his image with the ability to know him and with the rational capacity to map onto the external world and extract inferences and make deductions and develop technology and send a rocket ship to the moon. Truth is a viable product here, and it's why the universities started by Christians. And Harvard's motto was truth for Christ and the church. Well, if naturalism is true and evolution is true, it seems like the modus operandi is survival. And survival doesn't require all and only true beliefs. Let me give you an illustration about perceptual beliefs. Suppose you are in the Serengeti and there's a lion approaching. And, Henry thinks that the lion is very close. The lion is, in fact, 1,000 yards away. But Henry has got perception problems like color blindness. His perceptions aren't accurate. So he sees it as 100 yards away. Ramon, by contrast, has accurate, truth-conducive perceptions. Truth is what corresponds to reality. And Ramon sees it as 1,000 yards away, like it is. Well, tell me, Henry sees it as 100, Ramon sees it as 1,000. Which one is the first one that is going to flight? Henry, the one whose perceptions gave him a false view of reality. And this is what Alex Rosenberg, who writes The Atheist Guide to Reality, admits. That there are certain things that we shouldn't think that the mind should give us in terms of truth. It's not truth conducive. It's survival conducive. And abstract algebra and philosophical thinking aren't required for the lion to be the toughest beast in the Serengeti. Now, if naturalism is true and evolution is true, it provides an internal defeater for all beliefs, including the belief that naturalism and evolution are true, right? So you got a major problem for the naturalist who believes evolution is true. The theist is better off. If evolution's true, then theism should be true, more so than if evolution is true, then naturalism is true. If evolution's true and naturalism's true, we're doomed. So anyway, we go in that direction. Marx has got a problem. The Christian view solves that. Marxist view doesn't solve that. The naturalist view doesn't solve that. The Freud and Marx objections don't solve it because they are de jure objections about the rationality of religious belief. They are not de facto objections about the fact of whether or not God exists. And yet you cannot do a de jure, a rationality objection, without first knowing the answer to the de facto. Because if God does exist, it means that the person who disbelieves is, in fact, the one who is deceived.
Dr. Miller.
Yeah.
You're still on that slide, right? You are not moving.
I am, which means we got a whole lot of room to cover.
Just to make sure that.
All right. So I'm gonna run forward. Look, workers of the world unite. Marx wasn't about reformation. He was about revolution. He saw conflict resolution going in one historic direction. And if the problem is social oppression, the solution is social liberation, social justice. You don't need Jesus for that. The Neo-Marxism of Antonio Gramsci. I'm going to go through this as fast as I can, but I've got a lot to say. I'll probably focus more on the premier Italian reformer and one premier German reformer Marxist. They're revolutionaries. They're not reformers anyway. And so, in the early part of the 20th century, many of Marx's earliest followers, they started becoming aware of Marx's problems with his predictions, his calculations, his misunderstandings of things. And so they scratched their heads and they went off to Frankfurt, Germany, and a place in Italy, and they tried to say, okay, Marxism's true, but let's tweak it a little bit. And so Gramsci was the one in Italy, imprisoned very early on by Mussolini for being a dissenter to the National Socialist Party, because he was an international socialist, a globalist socialist, a Marxist. And of course, Hitler and Stalin never got along real well. The counterpart up in Frankfurt, well, those guys likewise were under the thumb of the National Socialists of Hitler, not Mussolini. And it was pretty bad for them because they weren't only globalist socialists, but they were also Jews. Ooh, bad place to be in 1933 at the rise of the National Socialist Party. You're going to have to get out of there quick. Anyway, back to Gramsci. Gramsci went to prison very early on, and he wrote the prison notebooks. As it turns out, these prison notebooks were most authoritatively translated by someone right here in Indiana, a professor at Notre Dame University, who was the president of the International Gramsci Society, Joseph Buttigieg. That is Mayor Pete Buttigieg's dad, who ran for Democratic president and is now in the cabinet under the Biden administration. His dad was the president of the society, if that tells you where things are going there. Gramsci's diagnosis of the problem was a bit different. He said, look, Marx was always about revolution, or like the flag behind me. Go for a frontal attack. Go for the war of movement, as Gramsci would call it. He said, you can't do that in these Western nations. We find that there is this moat around the castle. And it's got all of these things that just buttress the castle. And unless you put sand in the moat, unless you clear the moat somehow, you're never going to be able to make a successful frontal assault, like the Russian Revolution, like the Chinese Revolution, like the Korean Revolution, like you name it, revolution, the Castro-Cuban Revolution, Venezuelan Revolution. You're never going to be able to do it in the West because of these things in the civil society. So he divided societies into political societies and civil societies. And the political society was the the castle, so to speak. It was law enforcement, it was military, it was policemen, government. That was the coercive element of society. You can't do that. Not in the West. It's too powerful. You got to go after the civil society, the non-coercive element, religion and education. And when you get those, when you've sufficiently dumped sand into the moat, then the frontal assault, the war of movement, is decisive. And that's what then tweaked to new Marxism, Neo-Marxism, cultural Marxism. We've got to go after the whole culture outside of the moat. It's not just class. It's not about economic man. It's much deeper. But it's not as though Marx didn't already have the seedbed here. He already talked about religion as being the criticism of all criticisms. It's just that Gramsci very much unpacked this in his prison notebooks. Well, he had buddied up with a guy named George Lukács, who was one of the fathers of the Frankfurt, Germany school of critical theory. We'll get there a little bit, but this cultural Marxism he saw as the problem. And so he saw that there was this cultural hegemony, the hegemonic narrative. This comes from Gramsci, where it comes from our word exegesis of scripture, leading out. That leading element of culture is what we need to go after. And it is this cultural that provides the norms, the beliefs, the values of a culture. And it just keeps propping up that castle. So you've got to go after it. You can't do the frontal assault. You've got to do the war of position, which is trench warfare, a long, drawn-out, methodological, very patient approach to infiltrating the cultural institutions in the West. And that was the plan. And he said that one of his German followers called it the Long March through the institutions, which actually comes from the Maoists' Long March in real warfare, but the Long March through the institutions. And Gramsci said, in the new order, socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture via infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media by transforming the consciousness, wokeness of the society, academia, media, ecclesia. That's what's going on in the West. We are in a revolution. The larger goal then would then go toward the law courts and police and so forth. In America, that's already happening. This process is getting quite matured. You've got to subvert civil society by changing culture, and it changes culture by infiltrating institutions. And so the goal is clear: destroy capitalism and replace it with communist counter hegemony. And so we, to dig a little bit deeper on this, I just read that to you. Is where we're at. So, remember when Mao said that revolution is not a dinner party? In Maoist revolution, it was violent. Likewise with the Russian Revolution. A revolution is never a dinner party, but sometimes it seems like it up until the war of movement. We don't feel like we're experiencing revolution right now. But America, I assure you, we are in a cultural neo-Marxist revolution right now. And time will tell whether we get to the war of movement or not when it gets to that non-dinner party. Right now, it very much feels like a wine and cheese dinner party with the politicians and so forth. But Gramsci says Christianity must be replaced. He wrote in 1916, socialism is precisely the religion that must kill Christianity. It is a religion in the sense that it too is a faith, and because it has substituted for the consciousness of the transcendental God, trust in man and his best strengths as the sole spiritual reality. He's viewed as the father of cultural studies in sociology today. Perhaps the most important communist thinker in the West since Marx himself. And nowhere are his ideas found more than in academia. And that's why Ratio Christi is targeting, in a very Gramscian principled fashion, the infiltration of the academia. As go the universities, so goes the culture. And right now, as goes the US universities, so goes the world, given its notional window of influence. So his view is, it's no less of a revolution. It's about the disrupting, the dismantling, and the destroying of Western civilization, but starting from the soft tissue first. You cannot ever decapitate the West without decapitalizing the West, because it's part of that moat that continues to drive people forward in inequality, because people are incentivized to make a buck. They're incentivized to be innovative, to develop new drugs, new technologies, because there's a self-interested reward behind it. You've got to be able to get rid of that. You've got to make people sick of capitalism and see it rooted in a sick worldview, a religious worldview. And so that was part of what his hope was. The Frankfurt School, 1923, but I'm going to sort of fast forward through some of this stuff. I'll put a link in there for that other article that you can find more details on some of these people, but I will say this, because we're going to cruise through more quickly than I would like to. You can find this book. This is what my Marxist professor would advocate, and it's an authoritative text by Martin J., The Dialectical Imagination. It's a history of the Frankfurt School and the Institute of Social Research, as they called it. It was Neo-Marxism. Their leaders knew Gramsci, they got along, they adopted some of Gramsci's views, and they were called the School of Critical Theory, which is where critical race theory and sex theory and gender theory and all other theories are going to come from. Critical, 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 critical. So, you begin with, the Institute, what it was. George Lukács was the founder of it. And for him, the revolutionary destruction of society was, quote, the one and only solution to the cultural contradictions of the epoch. He thought that introducing and replacing Judeo-Christian sexual ethics with a more robust sexual ethics was necessary. Almost all of the leaders of that school of thought did this. The sexual revolution comes from this school of thought. He talked about introducing a radical sex education program into all schools to weaken the bourgeois family. Hungarian children learned the subtle nuances of free love, sexual intercourse, the obsolete nature of monogamy, and the irrelevance of organized religion, which deprived man of pleasure. Women were called to flaunt. If you got it, flaunt it. Their sexual mores, and the wives to rebel against their husbands. And this stuff was just out in the open. But it's Freudianism. And this is, if I had more time, I'd love to do so and focus more on him, but need to move on. Erich Fromm was one of the founders. Also, he was a social psychologist who was brought in to integrate Freudian sex thought and Marxian thought. He wrote books like The Art of Loving, The Heart of Man, Escape from Freedom, and others. His views on human sexuality were marked by a radical constructionist outlook. He said, another author said, Fromm contended that sexual orientation, we've heard that word before, is merely a social construct. Oh, like gender construct, right? It's merely a social construct, and there are no innate differences between men and women. Oh, we've heard this most recently. And that sexuality and gender roles are socially determined. That sexually repressed societies discourage sexual experimentation and practices such as homosexuality due to man-made legal codes and moralistic taboos that are psychologically inhibiting and counterproductive. Same with Theodor Adorno. I'm not going to spend much more time on him just because of a lack of time. A very keen player is Herbert Marcusa. Like Fromm, he was convinced that cultural liberation needed to be complete sexual liberation. It was vital to his viewpoint. He was the one who wrote the book Eros and Civilization, a philosophical inquiry into Freud in 1955, a further attempt to combine Neo-Marxism and Neo-Freudianism. And it caught the attention in the 1960s. So what happened was these guys had to leave Germany quick. They went to Geneva shortly, but then went to Columbia University in New York City, moved on to Brandeis University, moved out to the West Coast into UCLA and so forth. And by the 60s, their books, their tracts, their pamphlets had now taken root and were the archetype for the 60s sexual student revolution in America and around the world. So that Herbert Marcusa was viewed as the faculty advisor to the 60s sexual revolution. He talked about, casting off sexual restraint in favor of polymorphous perversity, a term Marcusa borrowed from Freud. And, it's very interesting that the Jewish moral philosopher, the moral philosopher of all moral philosophers today. I've been to his office at Princeton. I invited him here to Purdue to debate William Lane Craig. He was going to charge me $30,000. And I was like, no, sorry, $25,000. And I was like, no way. Because then I'd have to pay Craig $25,000 too. And I'm a missionary. But I'm not going to pay that kind of money, but that's what he wanted. So I went with Rosenberg, if you've ever seen the book, The Debate with William Lane Craig and Rosenberg, out of which one of my books came is Faith in God, Reasonable. But, the polymorphous sexual philosopher Peter Singer did his BA in 1967. He was in grad school in 1968, the year that the universities shut down in Rome, in France, in Mexico, in Berkeley, in Chicago, all around the world. And they were carrying in Rome and in Paris signs that said, Marx, Mao, and Marcusa. Marx, Mao, and Marcusa. Marcusa met over there with the president of Vietnam. Marcusa's doctoral student was Angela Davis, who received the Lenin Award from Russia. She's today still a UCLA professor and one of the earliest advocates of the abolition of prisons and police. Female, black, lesbian, and one of the early proponents of critical race theory. She was his doctoral student. But Peter Singer did his Oxford thesis in 1971, the year of John Lennon's song Imagine, on civil disobedience. Go figure. We can't do cultural apologetics without recognizing cultural Marxism. They talk about the slogan, make love, not war. When I rebel, I want to make love. Were popular in the 1960s during the anti-war, free love, sexual revolutions. And remember, the Beatles emerged in 1963. Lennon wrote his song in 71. Everything in between that, you've got this mix of Mao, Marcusa, Marx. Yes, there are Marxism, but they all come from the same rotten trunk. Freud explains what he meant by this expression. He says, what makes an infant characteristically different from every other stage in human life is that the child is polymorphously perverse, is ready to demonstrate any kind of sexual behavior with any kind of pleasure, without any kind of restraint. But the child is not meant to remain like this. Indeed, maturation and civilization emerge only after such polymorphous perversity is restrained and possibly rechanneled. And so they had to have heterosexual coupling for survival, but they didn't want it. They wanted to rebel against it. This is where Marcusa got the ideas. He wanted to retrench Marxian economic man to Marxian sensual man. And I want to show you this video briefly. I show this to my ethics students at Indiana University. And by the way, at Indiana University in Bloomington was where the Kinsey Institute of the Sexual Revolution began. And Alfred Kinsey did research on the erection of 1- and 2-year-old boys. I mean, this stuff's sick, where pedophiliism came from, right? The Man-Boy Love Association. Now, Peter Singer is the most famous moral philosopher alive today. He teaches at Princeton. I want you to just listen to him for 5 minutes. He's a Jew, and he's a Marxist.
Should become more prevalent.
Can you hear that?
Would be a wonderful thing. Okay. Would greatly reduce the amount of unnecessary suffering.
Oh, I need to...
Should become more prevalent. Would be a wonderful thing. Would greatly reduce the amount of unnecessary suffering in the world.
Which of the ideas that you have defended do you struggle most with personally in terms of the outcome of the idea?
Well, I think all of them have difficult boundary issues, if you like. So, I mean, you raise questions about the possibility of defensible animal experimentation. I certainly struggle with that. There's issues about children with disability and that I think if the parents don't want them to live, they shouldn't have to require them to live. And again, where do you draw boundary lines for that? And what children can have good lives and should be rather adopted by families who would give them good lives. And then in the topic we were just talking about, obviously I struggle personally with how much I'm doing myself and how much we need to do and how we can best use that money to make sure that it's effectively used for the long-term and sustainable relief of poverty and improvement of the world. That's a big issue as well.
I'm nervous about raising this topic, but it is a topic you've raised yourself, and it's one that you've now been greatly criticized for. And that is, if one steps away from speciesism and recognizes no moral distinction in terms of the different species, any more so than one recognizes a moral distinction in terms of race or gender, in terms of racism or sexism, this may lead some people to say, well, human beings and animals can enjoy affectionate relationships that are indeed sexual at times. And you've recently gone into print and said that as long as the animals are not harmed, there's no moral objection to bestiality.
I haven't exactly said that. I mean, the only thing I've written on this is a book review in which I simply described what was in the book. And I said, look, a lot of people seem to have great abhorrence of this. Why is that? Is it because we're just trying to preserve this gulf between humans and animals again? And the idea that some humans might want to have some sexual connection with an animal somehow threatens the gulf that we'd like to dig between ourselves and the animals and, put ourselves up on a pedestal. And what I said is, look, obviously there are some forms of human sexual interaction with animals that are simply cruel and harm the animals in various ways. You can think of others if you want to. I don't know how graphic a description you want, but you can think of others where the animals are free to come and go if they wish, where they're not being harmed in any way. And so...
They consent.
If you like, they consent as much as animals can ever consent to anything. Yeah, sure. So is there really a problem here? What is the problem? Okay, it's a bit abhorrent. We see it as unnatural, as deviant, and so on. But, that's how people used to think about other forms of sexuality that we now accept. So why is this particular taboo a taboo that has stuck, whereas taboos against masturbation or sexual relations between people of the same sex have not stuck? And I think perhaps the diagnosis here is that it's something to do with this gulf that we like to have between ourselves and animals. And as I said, I don't see much of a basis for that. But that's not to say that there aren't any objections that anyone might have to it, or that I'm sort of giving it my blessing or anything like that. Just to raise questions about why is it that we still have this deep abhorrence about something that you can hardly even discuss it. Whereas, as I say, with things like sexual relations between people of the same sex, we've definitely moved on, and I think progressively moved on to a more open attitude where we can talk about it and we don't have to regard people as somehow abhorrent or disgusting because they engage in it.
Well, again, I can anticipate someone saying the logic of that might take you to places that you really ought to struggle with philosophically and morally. For example, one might say, just as interspecies sexuality has been frowned on in the past, but there may not be a moral objection to it, intergenerational sexuality has been frowned on in the past and indeed in the present, but there perhaps should be no moral objection to pedophilia or to adults engaging in sexual contact with 10-year-olds who appear to give some recognition and consent.
Well, I mean, I think the issue here is whether this harms the 10-year-olds and will harm them in their sexual lives later on.
There are some pedophile campaign groups who say there is no lasting harm.
Well, obviously, you need to have a look at the evidence as to whether that's true.
If there was no lasting harm psychologically, would that pedophilic encounter be justified?
Look, I'm not going to answer that question because I think you have to really consider that question more thoroughly, and I don't think there is any kind of evidence about that, and I don't want to say things that some people will regard as justifying pedophilia when clearly there isn't.
Isn't that the logic of your position, though? As long as the child is not in the long term harmed, you can't rule out the moral permissibility of that behavior.
Well, I mean, I guess the logic of my position is that, as elsewhere, I'm a consequentialist. I'm concerned about preventing harm of various kinds. I don't have kind of intrinsic moral taboos, if that's your point. Yes, I don't have intrinsic moral taboos about that. So you can't rule it out
as a morally legitimate action.
If you think that whether actions are right or wrong depend on their consequences, you can't rule anything out until you know something about the consequences.
Nothing.
It's just wrong, though, isn't it?
No, I don't see that you can say that. That's not my view, right? My view is not that anything is just wrong, full stop.
All right. You hear that? Nothing is just wrong, full stop. Nothing. The most famous moral philosopher alive, teaching at Princeton, a Marxist, a Jew whose family were victims in the Holocaust, believes that bestiality is okay, and to deny it is to be guilty of speciesism, a form of discrimination, because on what ground do we distinguish humans from animals? Right? These are implications of Marxist view. Marx wanted to dedicate Das Kapital to Darwin. You mix the two, how do you have a problem with rape? How do you have a problem with anything? How do you have a problem with the gulag if the consequences dictate you need to take one for the team? It's necessary to arrive at utopia, as has happened every single time this socialist experiment has been tried. It's a godless, ethicless viewpoint, because you can't do ethics without first doing metaphysics. And so Singer writes the book, The Unsanctifying of Human Life, where he says in the West, we have presupposed the sanctity of human life like the hub to the spokes of a wheel, where the spokes go out to every single ethical issue from beginning to end of life, to economic ethics, to you name it, ethics. But if there is no sanctifier, then there is no sanctity. And that means anything goes if the consequences dictate it. And the Frankfurt School, I don't have time to read their quotes on it, but they talk left and right about violence. And Marcusa says, since when was a revolution concerned with ethics? Marx doesn't have a ground for justice, much less social justice. He doesn't have the metaphysical resources in his worldview to even say, workers of the world, unite, be active. Where does free will even come from? We don't need Marx. We don't want Marx. We have a better Jew than Singer or than Marx. We have Jesus. I'll say one or two more things about Marcusa, then we'll take a break. Marcusa talked about repressive tolerance. And this is very intimate with me because I had to get legal representation as an ethics professor at Indiana University when I had a former pastor who turned gay and charged me with creating a suicidal environment merely because I gave both sides on homosexuality. I educated rather than indoctrinated, and that was a problem for the university as well. Because there is truth and there is political truth. There's justice and there is social justice. See, we adopt the view, so do classical liberals, even classical atheist liberals, adopt the view emerging from Voltaire, from his biographer, I may disagree with what you say, but I would defend to the death your right to say it. Stalin, by contrast, is alleged to have said, ideas are more powerful than guns. We don't allow our enemies to have guns. Why should we let them have ideas? This cultural Marxism is this source. It is the poisonous root of cancel culture we're all seeing right now. And even leftists who are atheists are recognizing this and trying to fight back against the new left, which is what it was called in the 60s. And he says this about in Repressive Tolerance. It's a very short article. You should read it. Repressive Tolerance. Google it and read it. Tolerance cannot be indiscriminately equal with respect to the contents of expression, neither in word nor in deed. It must discriminate. It cannot protect false words and wrong deeds which demonstrate that they contradict and counteract the possibilities of liberation. Such indiscriminate tolerance is justified in harmless debates and conversation and academic discussion. It is indispensable in the scientific enterprise, but in private religion. But society cannot be indiscriminate where the pacification of existence, where freedom and happiness themselves are at stake. Here, certain things cannot be said. Certain words cannot be said. Free speech is out. Certain ideas cannot be expressed. Thought police, the Red Army comes in. Certain policies cannot be proposed. Certain behavior cannot be permitted without making tolerance an instrument for continuation of servitude. One can rightfully speak of a cultural revolution since the protest is directed to the whole cultural establishment, including the morality of existing society. There is one thing we can say with complete assurance. The traditional idea of revolution and the traditional strategy of revolution has ended. What we must undertake is a type of diffuse and dispersed disintegration of the system. He goes on to talk about oppressive tolerance as something that we tolerate the misdeeds of the left, and this is why we have a double standard, but we cannot and never should tolerate anything from the right. And so whereas we cry foul and double standard, that's part of the game plan here. They cannot tolerate it. When that gay student in my class, when I said, what about tolerance? I thought we talked about this. He smiled at me and said, I don't believe in being tolerant to the intolerant. Goodbye and good luck. And until I had two atheists who got my back and Alliance Defending Freedom came in with 4 letters across the bow to sue the university, I was exonerated. But I would have been fired without even them listening to the lectures, because there is truth and there is political truth. All right, let's take a break. I've got a ton to cover when we come back, so let me hold off questions. Okay, maybe 5-minute break if that's okay, Ramon?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And you can continue when you come back, Dr. Miller.
Okay. 5-minute break here.